"Ma'am, this property hasn't been in your name for over a year." The young man behind the desk said it politely, like he was reading off a script, but the words didn't land softly. They hit something deep inside my chest, something that didn't make sense. I remember blinking at him once, twice, as if my eyes might correct what I just heard. "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my voice steady. "There must be a mistake. I've owned that house for over 30 years. He gave me that careful smile people use when they think you're confused but don't want to say it out loud. He turned his monitor slightly, just enough for me to see. My name wasn't there. Not where it should have been. Not anywhere. Instead, in clean official letters was a name I knew very well. Sophia Collins. My daughter-in-law. I didn't react. Not the way you might expect. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand answers. I just stared at the screen for a second longer than necessary, then nodded slowly, as if I understood something simple, something ordinary. "Thank you," I said, folding my hands neatly in my lap. "That's very helpful." Helpful. That was the word I chose. Even as something inside me began to shift. The office felt colder when I stood up. Or maybe it was just me. I walked out into the parking lot, the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the pavement, and for a moment, I couldn't quite remember why I'd come there in the first place. It had been something routine. Something small. I'd planned to update a few records, make sure everything was in order now that it had been 3 years since my husband passed. 3 years of learning how to live alone in a house that still felt like it belonged to 2 people. 3 years of trusting that at least the foundation of my life, my home, my name, my memories remained untouched. I sat in my car but didn't start the engine. My hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, and I noticed they were perfectly still. That was the strange part. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't overwhelmed. I was thinking. Carefully. Quietly. Because there are moments in life when everything breaks all at once, loud and obvious. And then there are moments like this. Silent. Precise. Where one small detail doesn't line up and suddenly nothing does. I replayed the clerk's words in my mind. Over a year. Not recently. Not by accident. This wasn't a paperwork delay or a clerical error. This was something deliberate. Something completed. Something finished long before I ever thought to question it. I drove home slowly, taking the same streets I'd driven for decades, past the grocery store where my husband used to insist on picking out the freshest produce, past the little park where my son used to play when he was small, before life became so busy, before conversations became so short. When I pulled into the driveway, everything looked the same. The white trim. The oak tree out front. The porch light I always left on even during the day. It was still my house. At least it looked that way. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of lavender cleaner, the one I'd used every Saturday morning for as long as I could remember. I set my purse down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, listening. The refrigerator hummed softly. A clock ticked somewhere in the living room. Ordinary sounds. A normal home. I walked to the hallway cabinet where I kept my documents. Insurance papers. Property tax statements. Old files I hadn't needed to open in years because I believed everything was exactly as it should be. I pulled the drawer open and ran my fingers over the folders, each one labeled in my own handwriting. My name. Margaret Collins. It was everywhere here. On every piece of paper I'd carefully organized, every bill I'd paid, every record I'd trusted. And yet, somewhere else in a system I hadn't seen until today, it had been erased. Not by time. Not by mistake. By someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I closed the drawer gently. Not quickly. Not with frustration. Just a quiet, deliberate motion. Like placing something fragile back where it belonged. Because now there was a question I couldn't ignore. Not anymore. When had it changed? And more importantly, who had been standing close enough to me to change it without me noticing? I did not open the drawer again that afternoon. Instead, I made myself a cup of coffee the same way I always did, 2 teaspoons of sugar, a small splash of cream, stirred slowly until the color settled into something familiar. I carried the mug to the kitchen table and sat down in my usual chair, the one that faced the window overlooking the backyard. The garden was still there, just as I had left it last week, neat rows of herbs, the rose bushes trimmed carefully along the fence line. Everything looked the same, and yet it was not. I took a sip of coffee and let the warmth settle in my chest, grounding me. Because panic would not help me. Confusion would not help me. I had lived long enough to understand that when something did not make sense, the worst thing you could do was react too quickly. I thought about the timeline. Over a year, the clerk had said. That meant this did not happen yesterday. It did not happen last week. It happened while I was living here, sleeping in this house, paying the bills, trusting that the life I had built with my husband still stood on solid ground. I set the cup down and stared at the faint ring it left on the wooden table. A year ago. I tried to remember what life had looked like then. It had been quieter, lonelier, but stable. My son Daniel had been visiting more often back then, or at least that is what I told myself. He would stop by on Sundays, sometimes with Sophia, sometimes alone, always in a hurry, always checking his phone. Sophia, on the other hand, had been more present, more involved. She would walk through the house with a kind of confidence that I used to admire, offering to help organize things, suggesting small improvements, talking about how overwhelming it must be for me to manage everything on my own. I had thought she was being kind. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the memories come back the way they wanted to. Not forcing them, just observing. There had been paperwork. I remembered that clearly now. Not one specific document, but several. Small things. Insurance updates. Tax forms. Routine matters that felt too complicated for me to handle alone, especially after my husband passed. Sophia had offered to help. Of course she had. She always had a way of stepping in at just the right moment with just the right tone. Calm. Reassuring. Efficient. It is just a formality, she would say, sliding papers across the table toward me, a pen already placed neatly beside them. We just need to keep everything up to date. And I had signed. I had not questioned it. Not really. Because why would I? She was family. She was my son's wife. I trusted her the way you trust someone who has already been inside your home, shared your meals, smiled at you across the dinner table. I opened my eyes and looked around the kitchen again. But this time, I noticed something different. Not the furniture. Not the layout. Something quieter. Something in the feeling of the space itself. It no longer felt entirely mine. That realization did not come with fear. Came with clarity. Slow and steady, like a light being turned on in a room I had not entered in years. I stood up and walked to the living room, my footsteps soft against the hardwood floor. On the mantel, framed photographs lined up in careful order. My husband smiling beside me at our 30th anniversary dinner. Daniel as a boy, holding up a baseball trophy that was almost too big for his hands. And more recent ones. Daniel and Sophia standing together in front of this very house, their arms around each other, their smiles wide and confident. I stepped closer and picked up that last frame. Sophia's hand rested lightly on Daniel's chest, her posture relaxed, as if she already belonged here in a way that went beyond visiting. I studied her expression. It was not cruel, not cold, just certain. Certain in a way that made my stomach tighten slightly, because certainty does not come from nowhere. It comes from knowing something other people do not. I set the frame back down exactly where it had been and took a slow breath. There was a pattern here. I could feel it now, even if I did not yet see all of it clearly. The visits, the paperwork, the subtle shifts in how decisions were made around me instead of with me. The way Daniel had started deferring to Sophia on things that used to be simple conversations between him and me. It had not happened all at once. That was why I had not noticed. It had happened. Quietly. Gradually. Carefully. I walked back to the kitchen and glanced at the closed drawer again. I did not need to open it yet. Not today. Because this was no longer about finding a single document or correcting a small mistake. This was about understanding how something as solid as ownership, as identity, could be moved piece by piece without a single alarm going off. And more importantly, it was about understanding why no one had thought I would ever notice. I invited them to dinner 3 days later. I did not rush into it. I did not call them immediately after leaving the office or confront anyone with questions I was not yet ready to ask. Instead, I waited. I moved through my days the way I always had, quietly, deliberately, as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. When I called Daniel, my voice sounded normal even to me. I asked if they were free on Sunday, told him I would be making his favorite pot roast, the one I had been cooking since he was a boy. There was a brief pause on the line, just long enough for me to notice. Then he said yes. Of course. Sophia's voice appeared in the background, light and pleasant, asking what time. 6 o'clock, I said. The usual time. I spent the next 2 days preparing, not because I needed to impress them, but because routine has a way of revealing what people try to hide. I set the table with my best dishes, the same ones I had used for every family gathering for decades. I polished the silverware until it caught the light just right. I even placed fresh flowers in the center, white lilies, simple and clean. Nothing about the evening would feel unusual. That was important. When they arrived, everything looked exactly as it always had. Daniel stepped inside first, holding a bottle of wine he probably picked up on the way. Sophia followed, her smile warm, her posture relaxed, as if she had nothing to be concerned about. She kissed my cheek lightly and complimented the house, the flowers, the smell coming from the kitchen. I thanked her. I meant it. Because in that moment I was not playing a role. I was observing. We sat down at the table, and for a while the conversation stayed where it always did. Work. Weather. Small updates about people I had not seen in years. Daniel spoke about a new project at his company, his tone distracted, his attention drifting between me and his phone. Sophia filled in the gaps, her voice smooth, her words carefully chosen, as if she had already decided what version of their life I was allowed to hear. I watched them both. Not openly. Not in a way that would make them uncomfortable. Just small glances, small pauses, moments where I let silence sit a second longer than usual. It was in those spaces that things revealed themselves. Halfway through dinner, I asked a simple question. Not about the house. Not about anything important. Just a small, ordinary detail. Have you two been busy lately? I said, cutting into my meal slowly. Sophia answered first, just as I expected. It has been a little hectic, she said with a soft laugh. A lot of paperwork, a lot of changes, but everything is coming together nicely. Paperwork. The word settled between us, light and casual on the surface, but heavy underneath. I nodded as if it meant nothing. That sounds like a lot to manage, I said. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat. Not enough to draw attention, but enough for me to notice. He reached for his glass, took a sip, and did not look at me when he spoke. Sophia has been handling most of that, he said. She is really good with details. I let that sit for a moment. Then I smiled. She always has been, I replied. Sophia met my eyes then, just briefly. There was something there. Not fear. Not exactly. But awareness. As if she was measuring how much I knew, how much I suspected, how much I might say next. I did not give her anything. Instead, I continued eating, asking Daniel about his work again, letting the conversation drift back into safer territory. But the rhythm had changed. I could feel it. The pauses were longer now. The laughter a little thinner. The ease that used to fill this room had been replaced by something tighter, something more controlled. After dinner, we moved to the living room. Sophia complimented the arrangement of the furniture, the photographs on the mantel, the way everything felt so well kept. Her voice carried a note of ownership that most people would not have noticed. But I did, because I knew what it felt like to speak about a place as if it already belonged to you. Daniel stood near the window, checking his phone again, his reflection faint in the glass. I watched him for a moment, remembering the boy he used to be, the way he used to run through this house without a second thought, never imagining a day when it might not be mine. It is getting late, Sophia said after a while, her tone gentle but firm. We should head out. I walked them to the door just as I always did. Sophia hugged me again, her arms light around my shoulders, her smile unchanged. Daniel gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, already half turned toward the car. I stood there for a moment after they left, watching the taillights disappear down the street. Then I closed the door quietly and leaned my hand against the wood, feeling its solid, familiar weight. They had not said anything directly. Not a confession. Not even a slip obvious enough to confront. But I did not need that anymore. Because now I had something more valuable. I had confirmation. Not in words but in patterns. In glances. In the way certain topics were handled and others avoided. And most importantly, in the way neither of them seemed surprised by anything that should have shocked them. I turned off the lights in the living room and stood there in the dim glow for a moment, letting the silence settle around me again. The house was quiet, still, waiting. And for the first time since that afternoon at the office, I allowed myself to acknowledge a simple truth. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a plan. And I had just sat across the table from the people who carried it out. I did not sleep much that night, but it was not because of fear. It was because my mind had finally begun to organize what it had been quietly collecting for months, maybe even longer. Memories that once felt ordinary now carried weight. Small moments I had dismissed as harmless suddenly felt deliberate. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, letting those moments come back one by one, not rushing them, not forcing meaning where there was none, but recognizing patterns where they had always existed. The first one that surfaced was a morning in early spring, not long after the first anniversary of my husband's passing. Sophia had come over unannounced, her energy bright, her tone cheerful, carrying a folder tucked neatly under her arm. She had said she wanted to help me get everything in order. Her words gentle, almost concerned. I remembered how she had stood in this very kitchen, placing the folder on the table with a kind of quiet confidence, explaining that there were a few documents that needed updating. Insurance adjustments, property details. Nothing major, she had said. Just routine. I had believed her. I had even felt grateful. Because at that time the idea of sorting through legal documents alone felt overwhelming. I had trusted that she was making things easier for me. I could see it clearly now. The way she had guided the conversation. The way she had answered questions before I even finished asking them. The way she had kept things moving, not allowing too much time for hesitation. "It is just standard procedure," she had said more than once, sliding papers toward me, pointing exactly where I needed to sign. I had not read everything carefully. Not because I could not, but because I did not think I needed to. That was the part that settled heavily in my chest now. Trust is not something you lose all at once. It is something that gets used against you slowly, piece by piece, until you realize it was never being protected the way you believed. I turned onto my side and looked at the empty space beside me, the place where my husband used to sleep. He had always been careful with these things. Thorough. Patient. He would read every line, ask every question, never sign anything until he understood it completely. I used to tease him about it, calling him overly cautious. Now I understood why he had been that way. And more importantly, I understood how vulnerable I had become without him. The next memory came just as clearly. A visit from Daniel about 6 months after that morning. He had seemed distracted, more than usual, his answers short, his attention divided. Sophia had done most of the talking that day as well. I remembered mentioning something about property taxes, asking if the amount seemed higher than usual. Sophia had responded quickly, reassuring me that everything had already been reviewed, that adjustments had been made, that I did not need to worry about it. Daniel had nodded, agreeing without really engaging, as if the conversation had already been decided before I entered it. I had let it go. I had told myself that they were simply helping, that they were taking care of things I no longer needed to manage on my own. That was the story I had accepted. It was easier that way. Safer. But safety built on assumption is not safety at all. It is just delay. I sat up slowly, the early morning light beginning to filter through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. The house was quiet, just as it always was at this hour. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock downstairs, steady and unchanged, marking time the same way it always had. But time had not stood still. It had moved forward, carrying decisions I had not fully seen, actions I had not fully understood. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly. The street outside looked peaceful. A few cars passing by, neighbors starting their day, nothing unusual. Life continuing as it always does, even when something beneath the surface has shifted entirely. I let the curtain fall back into place and turned toward the door. There was no anger in me. Not yet. Just clarity. And clarity has a way of changing everything. Because now I was no longer looking at isolated moments. I was seeing a sequence. A careful, deliberate sequence of events that had led to a single outcome. My name removed. My ownership transferred. My place in this house quietly redefined without a single direct conversation. I walked downstairs and paused at the bottom of the staircase, letting my hand rest lightly on the banister. This house had held every version of my life. Every memory. Every piece of who I had been. And now, without my permission, without my full awareness, it had been turned into something else. Something that existed on paper in a way that no longer included me. The way it once had. I took a slow breath and walked into the kitchen again, my steps steady, my mind clear. This was no longer about wondering what had happened. I already knew enough to understand the truth. The only question left now was how far it went. And I had a feeling I had only just begun to see the edges of it. The next morning, I did something I had not done in years. I drove across town to a place I used to visit regularly when my husband was still alive. A small office tucked between a dental clinic and a tax preparation service. The sign outside had not changed. Neither had the quiet, understated professionalism inside. When I stepped through the door, the faint scent of paper and polished wood greeted me, familiar in a way that settled something inside me. I had not called ahead. I had not made an appointment. Some things do not require preparation. They require timing. And I had learned that timing matters more than most people realize. The receptionist looked up and smiled politely, asking how she could help. I gave her my name, Margaret Collins, and asked if Mr. Harris was still working there. There was a brief pause as she checked her screen, then a nod. "He is," she said. "Do you have an appointment?" I shook my head gently. "No," I replied, keeping my tone calm. "But I believe he will remember me." She hesitated for a moment, then picked up the phone. A few quiet words passed between her and someone on the other end before she gestured toward a hallway. "You can go right in," she said. I walked down that hallway slowly, my steps steady, my thoughts clear. When I reached his office, the door was already open. Mr. Harris stood behind his desk, older now, his hair thinner, but his posture still straight, his presence still composed. He recognized me immediately. I could see it in the way his expression shifted, not dramatically, but with a quiet understanding that did not need words. "Margaret," he said, stepping forward slightly. "It has been a while." "It has," I replied. We did not exchange pleasantries for long. That was not why I was there. I sat down across from him, placing my purse neatly beside my chair, and folded my hands in my lap. For a moment I simply looked at him, remembering how many times I had seen him sit across from my husband, reviewing documents, explaining details, making sure everything was clear before anything was signed. That memory mattered. It reminded me of the standard I had once lived by. "I need you to help me understand something," I said finally. My voice did not waver. He nodded once, leaning back slightly, giving me his full attention. "Of course," he said. I reached into my purse and pulled out a copy of the document I had requested from the office the day before. I had not shown it to anyone. Not yet. I placed it on the desk between us and slid it toward him. He adjusted his glasses and began to read. I watched him carefully, not interrupting, not rushing the moment. It did not take long. His expression changed slowly, almost imperceptibly, but I saw it. The slight tightening around his eyes. The pause in his breathing. The way his fingers rested just a little longer on one line before moving to the next. When he finished, he looked up at me, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "When was this signed?" I asked quietly. He glanced back down at the document, confirming what he had already seen. "A little over a year ago," he said. "The same timeline. The same quiet precision." I nodded once. "I do not remember signing this," I said. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for a second document from his drawer, something from his own records, and placed it beside mine. "This is the original property documentation your husband and you finalized," he explained. "Your name was primary. It was structured that way very deliberately." I looked at both papers side by side. One represented everything I had believed to be true. The other represented what had replaced it. "Is it possible," I asked, choosing my words carefully, "for something like this to be changed without the person fully understanding what they are signing?" He leaned back slightly, considering the question, not rushing to answer. "It is possible," he said finally, "if the documents were presented in a way that obscured their purpose. If trust was involved. If someone relied on another person to explain rather than verify. Trust." The word settled between us with more weight than anything else he had said. I nodded slowly, absorbing it. "And the signature?" I asked. "Is it mine?" He studied it again, this time more closely. It appears to be, he said. But that does not mean the context was clear when it was signed. I looked down at the page, at the version of my name that now carried a meaning I had never intended to give it. For a long moment I said nothing, because there is a difference between not knowing something and choosing not to see it. And I could no longer claim either. I lifted my gaze back to Mr. Harris, my expression steady, my thoughts already moving ahead. If I wanted to review everything that has been changed, I said, every document, every transfer, every adjustment, would that be possible? He did not hesitate this time. Yes, he said. It will take some time. But it is possible. I nodded once more, then gathered the documents carefully, placing them back into my purse with the same precision I had used when I first arrived. Nothing about my movements was rushed. Nothing about them was uncertain. Because now, for the first time since I had walked into that office days ago, I was no longer asking what had happened. I was preparing to see all of it. And more importantly, I was preparing to decide what to do with the truth once it was fully in front of me. Mr. Harris called me 2 days later. His voice was calm, professional, but there was something beneath it now, something more deliberate than before. I have gathered everything you asked for, he said. It is more extensive than I initially expected. I did not ask what that meant. I already knew. When I arrived at his office again, the folder waiting on his desk was thicker than the one I had brought before. He did not speak right away. Instead, he opened it and turned it toward me, allowing me to see the contents for myself. Page after page. Dates. Signatures. Transfers. Adjustments. Each one small enough to seem insignificant on its own. Together, they told a very different story. I sat down slowly, my eyes moving across the documents without rushing. I had learned something important over the past few days. When you rush through information, you miss the intention behind it. And intention was everything here. It was not done all at once, Mr. Harris said quietly, as if confirming what I was already beginning to understand. It was structured in stages. Each document builds on the last. I nodded slightly, tracing one line with my finger. A transfer of partial ownership. Then a restructuring of that ownership under a separate entity. Then another document redefining the terms of control. Each step appeared reasonable when viewed alone. Together they formed a path that led to one outcome. My removal. Not abruptly. Not visibly. But completely. And this entity, I said, pausing on a page that listed a company name I did not recognize. Who established it? Mr. Harris glanced at the document, then back at me. It was registered approximately 14 months ago, he said. The primary name associated with it is Sophia Collins. There it was. Not hidden. Not even disguised. Just placed carefully within a structure most people would never think to examine. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of that settle in a way that felt almost distant. Not because it did not matter, but because it mattered in a way that required control. Emotion could come later. Understanding had to come first. And Daniel? I asked. Mr. Harris hesitated for a fraction of a second. His name appears on some of the later documents, he said, primarily as a secondary signatory. It suggests awareness, if not direct initiation. Awareness. The word lingered longer than anything else. I closed the folder gently and rested my hands on top of it. For a long moment I said nothing, because this was the part where many people would react. Anger. Shock. Betrayal. But I had already moved past that point. Those emotions belonged to the moment of discovery. What I was facing now was something different. This was clarity. And clarity requires a different kind of response. They were patient, I said finally. Not a question. A statement. Mr. Harris nodded once. Yes, he said. Very. I looked down at the folder again, then back up at him. And legally? Asked. Where does that leave me? He took a breath before answering, choosing his words carefully. That depends on several factors, he said. The context in which the documents were signed. The level of understanding at the time. The nature of the relationship between the parties involved. Trust. Again the same word, now carrying even more weight than before. I nodded slowly, absorbing it. Because I understood now that this was not just about what had been done. It was about how it had been done, the method, the timing, the reliance on familiarity instead of scrutiny. I stood up, gathering the folder with both hands, holding it not as something fragile, but as something precise. Something that needed to be handled correctly. I would like copies of everything, I said. And I would like you to walk me through each document. Not quickly. Not generally. I want to understand every line. Mr. Harris did not hesitate. Of course, he said. We will go through it together. I nodded once, then turned toward the door, pausing briefly before stepping out. Margaret, he said. I looked back at him. You should prepare yourself, he added. Not just legally. Personally. I held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small steady nod. I already have, I replied. When I stepped outside, the air felt different. Not heavier. Not lighter. Just clearer. Like something that had been clouded for a long time had finally settled into place. I walked to my car and placed the folder carefully on the passenger seat before sitting down behind the wheel. I did not start the engine right away. Instead, I looked at it for a moment, at the collection of decisions that had been made without my full awareness, by people I had trusted without question. And for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to acknowledge something simple and undeniable. This was not just about what they had taken. It was about what they believed I would never do. Look closely, understand fully, and respond in a way they had not planned for. The next week, I became someone they did not expect me to be. I did not call. I did not question. I did not change my routine in any way that would draw attention. Instead, I leaned into it. The same quiet mornings. The same grocery trips. The same polite conversations when Daniel called, which he still did, though less often than he used to. And when he did, I sounded exactly as I always had. Warm. Interested. Unaware. You should come by this weekend. I told him one evening, my tone light, almost casual. I made too much of that soup you like. It will go to waste otherwise. There was a pause, not long but noticeable. Then he agreed. Sophia came too, of course. She always did. When they walked through the door that Sunday, nothing about their expressions suggested concern. If anything, Sophia seemed more relaxed than usual, her smile easy, her movements confident, as if she had already settled into a version of the future where everything was exactly as she wanted it to be. I watched her carefully as she moved through the house, noticing the way her eyes lingered on certain details. The kitchen, the hallway, the living room. Not as a guest would look, but as someone evaluating something that belonged to them. Daniel, on the other hand, kept his distance. Not physically, but emotionally. He spoke when spoken to, laughed when it was expected, but there was a subtle hesitation in him now, something that had not been there before. It was small, but it was enough. We sat down to eat, and once again the conversation stayed comfortably on the surface. Work, plans, small meaningless updates. But I had learned that the truth does not live in what people say. It lives in what they avoid. Halfway through the meal, I stood up and walked to the counter, reaching for a stack of papers I had placed there earlier that day. They were not the full documents. Not the ones Mr. Harris had given me. These were something else. Copies of older records. Harmless ones. Familiar ones. I brought them back to the table and set them down lightly. I found these while organizing, I said, my voice calm. Your father was always so careful with paperwork. I thought it might be a good idea to review everything again, just to make sure it is all still accurate. Daniel looked at the papers, then at me, then quickly at Sophia. It was a reflex. A silent check. Sophia smiled. Not broadly. Not nervously. Just enough. That sounds like a good idea, she said smoothly. Things change over time. It is important to keep everything updated. Updated. The word felt almost deliberate now. I nodded as if I agreed completely. Exactly, I said. That is what I have been thinking. I slid one of the papers slightly toward Daniel. You remember this one, do you not? He glanced down at it, his expression tightening just slightly before he forced it back into something neutral. Yeah, he said. Looks familiar. Sophia did not look at the paper right away. Instead, she watched me. That same careful awareness I had seen before. Measuring. Calculating. Trying to understand what I knew and what I was pretending not to know. I let the silence sit for a moment longer than usual, then smiled gently and pulled the paper back toward me. It is probably nothing, I said lightly. I just want to make sure I understand everything correctly. And that was it. No accusations. No confrontation. Just a suggestion. A shift. But it was enough. Because from that moment on, the energy in the room changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would alarm someone who was not paying attention. But I was paying attention. Daniel became quieter. More cautious. His answers shorter. His eyes avoiding mine more frequently. Sophia, however, adjusted quickly. She leaned into the role she had already been playing. Helpful. Reassuring. In control. If you need help going through anything, I can take a look, she offered, her tone warm, almost generous. I smiled at her, holding her gaze just a second longer than necessary. I appreciate that, I said. I might take you up on it. But I would not. Not anymore. Because help had been the door she walked through the first time. And I had no intention of opening it again. After they left that evening, I did not feel shaken. I did not feel uncertain. I felt confirmed. Because now I had seen how they reacted when even the smallest hint of awareness was introduced. Not panic. Not denial. Adjustment. That was the key. They did not break under pressure. They adapted. Which meant whatever they had done, they believed. It was secure enough to withstand questions. That belief would be their weakness. I walked back into the kitchen and looked at the papers still resting on the table. Then I gathered them slowly, stacking them neatly, aligning every edge. Because I understood something now that I had not fully realized before. This was not a situation that could be resolved with emotion or confrontation. It required precision, patience, and timing. They had built their plan carefully, step by step, believing I would never see it clearly. Now I would do the same. Only difference was I knew exactly what I was looking at. And I knew exactly what they had overlooked. By the end of that week, everything had shifted into place in a way that felt almost quiet, almost inevitable. Not because the situation was simple, but because I had stopped looking at it as something chaotic. There was structure now. Pattern I could follow. Path I could walk without hesitation. I met with Mr. Harris twice more, each time going deeper into the documents, each time understanding not just what had been done, but how it had been layered so carefully over time. It was not reckless. It was methodical. That was what made it effective. But that was also what made it traceable. Every decision leaves a mark. Every step leaves a record. And records, unlike people, do not change their story. If you choose to challenge this, Mr. Harris had said during our last meeting, you will need to be very precise. This is not about emotion. It is about evidence. I had nodded then because I understood that completely. Emotion had its place, but not here. Not yet. That night, I sat at my kitchen table again, the same table where I had signed those papers more than a year ago, and I spread out the copies Mr. Harris had given me. Not all of them. Just enough. Enough to remind me of what I was dealing with. Enough to keep my focus clear. I did not rush through them. I did not react to each detail as if it were new. I had already absorbed the truth. Now I was studying it, learning it, owning it in a way that no one else could take from me. There was one document in particular that I returned to more than once. The one that shifted primary control. It was written in language that sounded neutral, almost routine. But now that I understood its purpose, I could see how carefully it had been constructed. No single line gave everything away. But together they redefined everything. I traced my signature lightly with my finger. Not with regret, but with recognition. That moment had already passed. What mattered now was what came next. The following morning I made another call. This time it was not to Mr. Harris. It was to Daniel. My voice sounded the same as it always had when he answered. Warm. Steady. Familiar. I was thinking, I said, keeping my tone casual. It might be time for us to sit down together and go over some of the old documents, just to make sure everything is still aligned with what your father intended. There was a pause on the other end of the line, longer than usual. Then Daniel cleared his throat softly. Sure, he said. Yeah, we can do that. Good, I replied. I will set something up. I did not mention Sophia. I did not need to. She would be there. That was part of the pattern now. Later that afternoon, I walked through the house slowly, not as someone uncertain of her place, but as someone measuring it. The walls, the rooms, the small details that had once been invisible because they were so familiar. I noticed everything, not because I was trying to hold on to it, but because I was preparing to define it on my own terms again. In the living room, I paused in front of the mantel and looked at the photographs. My husband's smile. Daniel as a boy. The life that had existed here long before any of this had begun. Those things had not changed. They could not be altered by documents or signatures. They existed outside of that. But the present was different. And the future would be shaped by what I chose to do now. I picked up one of the frames and held it for a moment, studying it more closely than I had in years. Then I set it back down exactly where it had been. Nothing about this would be rushed. Not the conversations. Not the decisions. Not the outcome. Because the one advantage I had now was something they had not accounted for. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. That evening, I returned to the kitchen table and gathered the documents again, placing them back into their folder with careful precision. Every page aligned. Every detail accounted for. I closed the folder and rested my hands on top of it, feeling its weight settle into something steady, something controlled. They believed they had already reached the end of their plan, that everything had been completed, secured, finalized without resistance. But they had made one mistake. They had assumed that silence meant ignorance. They had assumed that trust, once given, would remain unquestioned forever. And now, as I sat there in the quiet of my own home, I understood exactly how to use that assumption against them. Not with confrontation, not with anger, but with something far more effective. Timing. And when the moment came, they would not be able to adjust. Not this time. The meeting was set for the following Thursday afternoon, not at my house, not at theirs, but at Mr. Harris's office. That choice was not accidental. Environment matters. It changes how people speak, how they sit, how they think. When Daniel and Sophia arrived, they were on time. That too was expected. Sophia greeted Mr. Harris with polite confidence, her posture composed, her smile measured. Daniel followed her lead, his expression neutral, his movements slightly restrained, as if he already sensed that something about this meeting was different, even if he did not yet understand how. I was already seated when they entered. The folder rested neatly in front of me, closed, untouched. I did not stand. I did not rush to greet them. I simply looked up and nodded once, acknowledging their presence without changing the tone of the room. "Thank you for coming," I said calmly. Sophia took the seat across from me, her hands folding lightly on the table, her eyes moving briefly to the folder before returning to my face. Daniel sat beside her, his posture slightly rigid, his attention shifting between me and Mr. Harris, who remained quietly at the head of the table. There was a moment of silence, just long enough to settle everyone into place. Then I opened the folder. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a simple, deliberate motion. I removed the first document and placed it in the center of the table. "I have been reviewing some records," I said, my voice steady, measured, controlled. "And I would like to understand how these changes came to be." I did not accuse. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The document spoke clearly enough. Daniel glanced down at it, then back up at me, his expression tightening slightly before he looked away. Sophia, however, leaned forward just enough to read the page, her face composed, her breathing even. "These appear to be standard updates," she said after a moment, her tone calm, almost reassuring. "Things that needed to be adjusted over time." I nodded once, as if I accepted that explanation. Then I reached for the second document and placed it beside the first. "And this?" I asked. "Was that also standard?" The room grew quieter. Not tense. Not yet. Just still. Sophia's eyes moved across the page, and for the first time, there was a pause in her response. Small. Controlled. But there. "Yes," she said finally. "It was part of a restructuring process. Something we discussed before." I let that sit for a moment, then looked at Daniel. "Do you remember discussing this with me?" I asked. He hesitated. "Not long, but long enough. I remember going over some things," he said carefully. "It was a while ago." "A while ago." I nodded again, slowly, thoughtfully. Then I reached for the final document. The one that mattered most. The one that completed the sequence. I placed it on top of the others, aligning the edges with quiet precision. And this one, I said, my voice softer now, but sharper in its clarity. This one transferred primary control. No one spoke immediately. The silence stretched, not awkward but revealing. Because in silence, people show you what they are thinking before they decide what to say. Sophia was the first to respond. Margaret, she said gently, her tone shifting just slightly, these decisions were made to simplify things, to make sure everything was managed properly. It was never meant to cause confusion. Confusion. The word settled in the room, but it did not belong there. I looked at her steadily, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more difficult to dismiss. Understanding. I am not confused, I said quietly. And that was the moment everything changed. Not because of what I said, but because of how I said it. Calm. Certain. Final. Daniel looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing something he had not expected to find. Sophia's expression did not break, but it adjusted just slightly, just enough to reveal that she understood the shift as well. I closed the folder slowly, resting my hands on top of it once more. I have taken the time to review every document, I continued. Every signature. Every transfer. I understand exactly what was done and how it was done. I paused, letting the words settle fully before continuing. And I have also taken the time to understand my options. Mr. Harris remained silent, but his presence carried weight now, a quiet confirmation that this was no longer a private misunderstanding. This was something structured. Something real. I stood up then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that the conversation had reached its conclusion. I am not here to argue, I said. And I am not here to assign blame. That part was true. This was not about emotion anymore. I am here to correct what was done under the assumption that I would never question it. I picked up the folder and held it lightly in my hands, not as a burden, but as something resolved. You believed I would not look closely, I added, my gaze moving between them, steady, unwavering. You were wrong. There was nothing more to say. Not from me. Because the next steps would not be spoken in this room. They would be documented. Filed. Executed with the same precision that had been used against me. I turned toward the door, pausing only briefly before stepping out into the hallway. Behind me, the room remained quiet. No raised voices. No sudden reactions. Just the sound of realization settling into place. And as I walked away, I understood something with complete clarity. They had not just changed my records. They had revealed themselves. And now I was the one deciding what happened next.